So, good afternoon. I'm Adam Melbourne. He, him, his. I guess my image description is a blonde hair, blue eyed male. I have APERT syndrome, APERT syndrome, and I'm here with Catherine Campisi.
Right.
Do you want to give an image description or anything?
Sure. Okay. I am a petite-sized woman with dark hair with a little bit of gray-white in the front to acknowledge and be proud of my age as well as my disability. I'm wearing glasses. I have a brownish hair, a little bit of gray-white, a blue shirt on and long sleeve shirt. And I'm very happy to be here today.
Okay. So first question right off the bat is, how do you meet Ed Roberts?
Okay. I met Ed Roberts in probably the mid to late 1970s. And I was very active. I lived in San Diego at the time, and I was active on the Independent Living Center board down there. At that time, it was called Community Service Center for the Disabled. And the two people that ran the center, they were co-executive directors at the time, were very good friends of Ed's. They had known him from the Bay Area. And so they introduced me to Ed, and that's how I met Ed.
Is there any specific role? What role did Ed play in your life, and how did he influence you?
Okay. Well, okay. So as I said, I met Ed when I was on the board of the Independent Living Center. I believe he was probably already the director of the Department of Rehabilitation, appointed by Jerry Brown in his first term, you know, the first person with a very significant disability to become the director of Department of Rehabilitation after he had been rejected to be a client because they said he couldn't go to work. So his whole life story really was a model and affected me in terms of what people with very significant disabilities can do. So my impressions of him were he was low key. He was not at all arrogant. He was very, very down to earth. Dressed a little bit like a hippie. This was the 70s and early 80s, and you might expect that. I don't think I ever saw him in a suit. I don't know if he ever wore a suit, but even the pictures I've seen him with Jerry Brown in meetings or being appointed, he was pretty casually dressed. He was very kind, but he was relentless, you know, in terms of being an advocate. He didn't stop at getting what he wanted. He was visionary, I think, was one of his greatest attributes. And we'll talk about that in a little bit in terms of how his work led to the starting of the whole Independent Living Center network, and, you know, how the ideas of the social model, you know, or what we call now the disability justice model, were starting to be thought of in other places other than Berkeley, but he really galvanized it and brought that, you know, to be something that was more accepted and the word widely spread over time. So those were my impressions of him.
All right. Well, I think you just answered your question. The next question is, describe your impressions of Ed. What was his personality like?
Okay, I sort of did that one. Let me go back and add, I talked a lot about that. He had a great sense of humor. We all know his thing about, I'm the vegetable in the room today, I'm an artichoke, you know, so he used humor a lot in talking about disability, which was great. He loved talking to young people with disabilities, which was wonderful. And I want to go back a little bit, what role Ed played in my life to question two, if that's okay, is eventually in 2000, I actually became the director of the Department of Rehabilitation. So, you know, several things, he played a huge role in that. That number one, you know, he gave me the idea that people with significant disabilities like myself had the potential to lead a department like Department of Rehabilitation. And I always, he and my dear friend Bill Tainer, who was the person that introduced me to Ed, or one of them, who also became Department of Rehab director for a few years before he passed away, sadly, when he was in office. Bill did. But both Bill and Ed, whenever I would have difficult decisions, or whenever I would think about, you know, what direction am I going to lead the Department of Rehabilitation, I would always think about, you know, what would Ed or Bill do? Like how would they deal with bureaucracy? How would they deal with people in the department that didn't really have the view of disability that I wanted them to have? How would they deal with new initiatives and that kind of thing? So both Bill and Ed, who by the time I got to be rehab director, had passed away, were like, my angels on my shoulder. When I didn't know what to do, I would just sit quiet for a minute and go, okay, what would Ed and Bill tell me to do? Or what would they do? So I can think about doing the same thing. So he played a huge role in my life in that regard. Yeah.
What wisdom or lessons did Ed pass on to you?
Well, he passed on to me, the idea that it's really important to have a vision of what you want to accomplish or how you want people with disabilities to be seen, and to be able to articulate that in a really meaningful manner and to have a consistent message around that. He also passed on to me and to others that, when you want to do something, you need to do it, make a plan for it and do it incrementally, like in founding the independent living centers. I don't know if you know the story, but he went to Berkeley, but while he was there, he had to live in the university hospital because they said his disability was too significant for him to just live in a regular dorm, which was crazy, but at least he did get to go. So then, when he got ready to graduate, he was like, well, now I'm going to graduate, but there are no like services like this in the community. So I'm going to be graduating from college and face looking at having to go into a nursing home. So he's like, well, that's just totally unacceptable. So the other, wisdom he got is get his a group of people that are like-minded together. So he got some of his buddies, they called the group the Rolling Quads, together. And so they thought, okay, how are we going to address this? So they came up with the idea of an independent living center, which had many of the same services that he got on campus, which were, referral to get attendance, wheelchair repair, a referral to find a place to live that was accessible, help with advocacy. So the first thing they did is they wrote a grant to the Department of Rehabilitation and got Center for Independent Living funded, one center there in California. So he had an idea, then he made a plan for it. He started small, get CIL funded. Then once that got funded and was going well, then he had, team of supporters and advocates out in the community that wanted to start a network of independent living centers in California. So then between them and him, they got legislation passed, Assembly Bill 204, to fund the independent living centers in California. So it's like, get a vision, form an idea, start small. When that builds, then go on to the next step and just, keep working on your plan. Don't give up, but you can't just like start to do something huge. You have to kind of go incrementally with it. The other thing was, in being an administrator at Department of Rehabilitation, to have in high leadership positions other people with disabilities. That was certainly wisdom from him that I utilized. And then just live a full life. It's like he was married, he had a son, he traveled the world, in days when things weren't very accessible. So, don't set limits on yourself, so those are some of the wisdom I got from him.
It's a very interesting philosophy, very intrinsical, very self-motivated.
Yes.
Intrinsic motivation, as an old math tutor of mine used to say, it's
Right.
something you want, something you're not going to wait for.
Exactly.
Independent living, you got to fight for it.
Yeah.
What do you think was Ed's legacy to leave more broadly?
Well, as I said, I think, the idea of the social model of disability rather than the medical model, that, really the disability is more, the effects of disability are more in the environment, that if we create an accessible world and we provide accommodations and services, that people will still have a disability, but it'll mitigate it and they'll be able to be included in the community in all aspects of life. That social model, he really galvanized that and got people, like I say, I was in the Midwest in college and a lot of us were talking about that back at our university, but he really pulled it together and galvanized it. And that just became, took off over time worldwide, that, that we need to get away from the medical model where, your disability is a disease or a condition, and it's up to you individually to, first of all, try to get cured. And if you can't get cured, to either, get your own accommodations, have somebody carry you up a flight of stairs, or, get your own interpreter or whatever, that we get away from that medical model into the social model. I think he had the worldwide impact of bringing that to fruition. That's why after he left rehab and went to found the World Institute on Disability, that concept had really taken fire in the United States, but he wanted to advance that worldwide. And that's not a small thing to do, because in certain cultures, there's still a shame about being a person with a disability in the family. People are still hidden. There are people that don't even have wheelchairs. They certainly don't have power to charge their adaptive devices and that kind of thing. So, talking about the social model, both in the United States and the independent living model worldwide, or something that he really, that was part of his legacy. The other thing was the whole model of the independent living centers. I mean, now there are 400 nationally independent living centers, and the National Council on Independent Living, called NICL, is one of the powerhouse organizations in Washington on behalf of people with disabilities. Well, all that is part of Ed's legacy, because he started that first independent living center, and he started the network of independent living centers. And from there, it grew to go on to other states. And I think there are even some in some other countries. But clearly, that's part of his legacy. And then I think, the individually, this idea that you can have a very, very significant disability. We know he slept in an iron lung. He used the respirator, during the day, with the hose to be able to get more air. But he still went on to be director of Department of Rehab, went on to get married, went on to be a father, went on, as I said, to travel worldwide. So again, on an individual basis is, as you said, if you have intrinsic motivation and you have a vision of where you want to go, really, don't let your disability limit you.
What was he like as a young activist before he kind of found his footing and set the stage for, I guess, independent living and disability rights philosophies?
I didn't know him then. My friend Bill would have known him then, because they were actually teenagers together in the polio ward. But I didn't know him back then, and I think he was just a typical teenager. I think I read somewhere that he liked to play baseball, and he sort of thought, being a jock was going to kind of be his future. But obviously that turned. One thing that's important to know about Ed is that his mother, Zona, who's still alive, she must be in her late 90s now, because I was trying to think about it earlier today, and I think Ed would be about 80 years old now. But you can see if I'm right. I don't know if you want to look up when he was born, but in any case, Zona is just a fierce advocate. So as a young man, after he got polio, she's the one that fought with the university, with him. But at that point, he was a very young man. To accept him and to get rehab to accept him. They're a great resource to our success. And Zona certainly was that for Ed. Yeah.
Can you share an anecdote or story about Ed that gives an idea of what kind of person he was? An anecdote?
Sure. I have one or two. Okay, so one of them was Ed was already director of Department of Rehabilitation, and I was on what was called the Rehabilitation Advisory Committee. And we had a meeting that was going to start on a Monday in Sacramento, and I had to fly up on Sunday. And I believe paratransit was not running on Sunday, and in those days, there were no accessible cabs, or the Super Shuttle didn't even exist with the accessible vehicle. So I was traveling with a friend of mine to come up, and we're trying to figure out, how am I going to get from the airport to the hotel? And, my chair could fold, but it was a big, huge house. It was a battery powered travel chair. So my friend said, well, let me just call Ed and see if he has any ideas. And so he called him, and Ed said, hey, I'll send my own driver to get Catherine. So that's what he did. So, he didn't have to do that. Here he was director of Department of Rehab, but he sent his own driver with his own van to pick me up and my friend and take us to the hotel. So that was really nice. And then, you know, he was very loving and warm when I'm the one that had to call him to tell him that Bill Tainer had passed away while he was, you know, in office as rehab director. And I remember Ed was just really, you know, wonderful about it. I was just heartbroken and about giving me support. And then we asked him, you know, would you come to Sacramento and speak at his memorial service? And, oh, absolutely. Just tell me where and when, and I will be there. I will clear my schedule and I will be there. So those are two examples of his kindness and, you know, not being tied up in his own position, but willing to help, you know, friends with disabilities.
When was the moment that you realized Ed was basically a game changer?
Well, I think at the point when he got appointed director of Department of Rehabilitation, which was around the time I met him, then I knew, you know, this man was going to make a worldwide impact. There was no question.
All right. And he had a heart too. I mean, he
Yes.
comforted you in your times of strife.
Yeah, he did. Yeah.
Okay. What is a funny story or memory that you have of Ed Roberts?
Well, the memory is the one about when he sent, you know, the people that his own driver to get me. I think the funny story I would say is, you know, his thing about, I love the thing about, you know, they say I'm a vegetable. Here I am a vegetable before you today, you know, and he'd change it. Today I'm an artichoke, or the next day I'm an acorn squash. So I always loved that story of his, you know, that was always good. He'd make joke of it that people would say he was a vegetable, you know.
Why did Ed Roberts choose to be an advocate?
Because he had to for survival. I would, you know, his choice was either probably, you know, live at home and have his mother take care of him as long as she could, or go live in a nursing home at some point, or advocate for his own needs. Because like me, he lived at a time where none of these services were in place, where you couldn't go to college unless you fought to get in and get the services you need. You couldn't get the services you need to live independently. There was no in-home supportive services funding to pay for an attendant if you couldn't afford it or your family couldn't afford it. So it was a matter of survival. I mean, he had to. And then what he had to do for himself, he began to see he could have a broader impact on helping other people. But I truly believe for him, it was a matter of survival and having any kind of quality of life. He had to become an advocate. And I would say still, you know, things are better. But I would say to each of you, I mean, don't you kind of have to be advocates to get by and to get done what you want, you know, in the world? I mean, we have to, I think one of the things about being a person with a disability is every day we have to be educators of other people about our disability, about what we can do, about what we need. And that gets really old and annoying. But so even though, you know, the services are much better now, I think the reality is if you're a person with a disability and you're going to accomplish a lot in the world, to clear a path for yourself, you have to be an advocate. And if you want to bring along other people with disabilities, you really have to be an advocate. So I would say for him, it started with survival, and then he saw what kind of a difference he could make, and that just really led to his vision and passion to help others as well.
How did Ed find or create his support system within the disability community?
Okay, I think I talked a little bit about this, but I'll try to go over it a little bit more. I think he found it when he went to UC Berkeley, and they had him live in that hospital on campus. They had other people with significant disabilities that were living there. So the first thing he got was a lot of peer support. And as you know, peer support and peer counseling, people with disabilities helping other people with disabilities, is a fundamental service and principle of the independent living movement and of creating his own support system. So I think that's where he met, you know, other people with disabilities, and where he began to get comfortable and see, hey, together we can do a lot that we can't do by himself, by ourselves. The other thing is, in that hospital setting, they provided him with attendant care and assistive technology and things like that. So, you know, he probably learned for the first time that he could have someone other than his mother do his attendant care. And so, from there, he began to get this idea, well, if they can do that for me here and they have hired attendants, whether it's other students or people from the community, then when I get out of college, if I build the right kind of support system, then I can do the same thing. I can live in the community because I can hire somebody to help me. And, with my peers, we can see what kinds of supports we need. We can help each other. Maybe we can share an attendant. Maybe if we need an attendant, somebody knows somebody who wants a job, so I think then when he got out of out of UC Berkeley and wasn't living in that hospital dorm anymore, then that's when they formed Center for Independent Living. And so then that had a lot of those services in place, finding a personal care attendant, accessible housing, helping you with advocacy. And so, he built those systems for himself, but then they became institutionalized in the Center for Independent Living, where they were available for other people and for him when he needed them, so he didn't have to have them on such an ad hoc basis. And then the idea of peers running the center, the idea that when he dreamed of the center, that the board and the management staff there to be a majority of people with disabilities running the center. So, he wanted the value of peers, other friends, helping him create his own support system for anybody with a disability was very important to him. Again, that's important to move us away from the medical model to the social model, because not always, but most of the time, other people with disabilities, have a different perception of disability than, some of the people certainly in the medical system or what other professionals were taught, at least in the past. So I think he created it coming out of college. Then he built it into the first Center for Independent Living. And, the important things to him were the fact that he could make decisions, even if he couldn't dress himself and get himself out of bed and all that. He could, by hiring his own attendants and creating that kind of a support system, he could still have control over when he got out of bed, what he wore, what he ate, where he went. He had the decision making. So I think, you guys both know that independent living isn't about being able to do everything for yourself, but it's about being able to make your own decisions that you wouldn't get to do if you were living in an institution, so or a nursing home. So he set up, that kind of a support system around him. And then, like I say, because he was so visionary and powerful, he set it up so that it could help, thousands of other people through the Centers for Independent Living.
Plus the word institution, adding to the fact that it has kind of a dismal connotation when it talks about the state of a disabled person. Or
right, definitely. Yeah.
In order to, I guess, if Ed were still alive and he'd see how much progress we've made in the decades or two since he passed, what should youth be doing or advocating for so that they can carry on Ed's legacy?
Okay. Well, we've come a long way, but we're not there yet. That's for sure. I think, there's still so much work to be done that I think youth, you all need to find what your passion area is, so if you really want to be interested in increasing accessible transportation, well, work on that, because there's certainly a need in that area. If you want to work on getting more people hired, in employment issues, there's work in that area. Certainly the idea of still sharing the message of the social model and now the disability justice model. The idea that I think a universal thing we need to advocate for is the idea that disability is part of diversity and it's part of the diversity agenda. And when they talk about diversity efforts and initiatives, that they should include people with disabilities. So that's, I think, a common thing, that no matter what your specialized interest is, that we should all be, loud and proud and clear about, we're a minority group. Our solutions and remedies to deal with the exclusion and discrimination we face are exactly the same ones that people of color and women and other LGBTQ folks face. Our remedies are the same. The Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act the language is virtually the same, except for race versus handicap, which is the term they used in those days, but race versus disability. So, we need to all be vocal about being included as part of the diversity agenda in hiring, being on boards of directors, being students in college, that we're not, quote, special, but we're part of diversity. If we want our systems, our workplaces, our communities to reflect the people who live in it, in their diversity, then that needs to include people with all types of disabilities. The bullying, I know, is an initiative you all focus on. I think another really good one is helping each other and other young people with disabilities, and starting with as young as you can go, to have a positive self-identity as a person with a disability. I don't know where you guys were, but when I got my disability when I was 10, and by the time I was 15, I was starting to use a wheelchair. And in those days, I didn't want to be around other people with disabilities. I don't know what I thought that meant, but I went to a regular school. I was a very good student. I had some idea that, those were those people and it wasn't me. It really took till I went to college and was in a college where there are a number of other students with disabilities. So I'm not sure if young people today don't have that barrier. I think they do, although, because I've been very involved in the Youth Leadership Forum for students with disabilities. And we see students all the time that come and say, I've been totally mainstream. I've never been around other people with disabilities. I feel uncomfortable. I don't want to have the label of disability. So helping young people build a positive identity that, it's fine to be a person with a disability. It's an attribute of who we are. We're proud of what it taught us, but we're other things too. I'm a female, you guys are male. You might want to study one area. I like to study another. I love my Italian and American culture. I love my kitty. I adore my husband. I love to travel. So I'm a lot of things. And I'm a person with a disability who's proud. So I think all of those things, but the two universal ones I would say are, making sure that we're part of the diversity agenda and also building a positive self-identity in all people with disabilities. It doesn't necessarily have to be young people, because it could be, I think some of the toughest people is that somebody middle-aged who just acquired a disability and now they're like, oh my God, now I'm a nothing. Now I can't do anything. I don't want this label. I don't want to be part
That's
of disability.
definitely an attitude among older adults, middle-aged, and both people who are middle-aged and seniors, that is an attitude. There's a need to change. Final question. What would be Ed's dream for people with disabilities in the community today?
Oh boy. Well, I think it would be, first of all, that all people can accept the idea that, disability is a concept that we don't have to be afraid of, that we all have different abilities and attributes at different stages of our life, and that there are a lot of services and accommodations that can help us address those. And so we need to be content with who we are as individuals, no matter our age, our type of limitation, and that the word disabled does not have a negative connotation, but has a connotation of it's an attribute of difference, not of deficit. So I think that's the first thing he would want. Then the second thing I think he would want is that, services are available worldwide to help all people, live in the community. So I think he would want, a strong and stronger program where people get supports to live in the community if they need attendance. And I think he would advance this to seniors with disabilities too. I suspect he would be very scornful of people sort of being pushed or whatever, or encouraged as soon as they need any kind of help with daily living activities of going into a nursing home. Again, it would be advance the idea of independent living to people, to seniors, and also to people with other types of disabilities. So I think he'd like to be a strong, robust, diverse disability community, people of all ages, people of all disabilities, united in purpose, not fighting over little turf battles, and united in purpose and strong, willing to demonstrate when we need to, willing to write thousands of letters, willing to take positions of leadership like he did, willing to be engaged at all levels so that we can just keep up the fight. I think that's what he would want.
It's not easy, but it should be at least attainable in some aspects. I'm hopeful we can carry on his legacy, even if we're not Ed, and even if I'm sure Ed and I would have both our agreements and disagreements, but I'll do it for him and we'll do it for ourselves.
Right, exactly. Right.